The locksmith was already at my door when I got back from buying groceries. 3 days after we buried George, 3 days since I'd stood in that receiving line at Peaceful Valley Cemetery, shaking hands with people who kept saying, "I'm sorry for your loss," like it was some kind of magic phrase that could bring him back. The sun was setting behind our old maple tree, the one George had climbed 30 years ago to hang a tire swing for the grandchildren who lived too far away to visit often. The same tree where yellow leaves were already starting to fall even though it was only early September. Everything was dying too soon. "Ma'am, your son said you'd given permission," the locksmith said, holding up a new deadbolt that gleamed silver in the dying light. He was a young man, maybe 30, with kind eyes and calloused hands. "We're changing the locks for your safety." I set my grocery bag down on the porch step. Milk that would probably spoil before I remembered to drink it. Bread I'd bought out of habit because George always liked fresh bread with dinner, frozen dinners that tasted like cardboard and grief. The bag crinkled in the evening air, and I noticed my hands were shaking. They'd been shaking since the funeral. "I didn't give anyone permission to change my locks." David stepped out from behind his truck like he'd been lying in wait, watching for me to come home. He held a clipboard in his hands, pen clipped to the side, looking every inch the successful insurance adjuster he'd become. Expensive suit, polished shoes, the kind of confident smile that worked on clients who needed to trust him with their worst moments. But this was my worst moment, and I didn't trust him at all. "Mom, we need to talk. The realtor's coming tomorrow morning at 9 sharp to do a complete walkthrough and assessment." "What realtor?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, like it was coming from underwater, like I was drowning in my own life. "Sharon Williams from Prestige Properties, best in the business." He said it like he was proud of himself for thinking ahead, for being the responsible son. "We found a buyer. Cash offer, $20,000 above asking price. No inspections, no contingencies. You'll be moved into Sunset Manor by the weekend. I've already put down the deposit and filled out your application." The words slammed into me with the force of cold water, like someone had opened a dam and let 47 years of security wash away in an instant. Sunset Manor, the place where Mrs. Henderson from down the street had gone to die, where the hallways smelled like disinfectant and despair, where they served dinner at 4:30 and locked the doors at 8, where the residents sat in wheelchairs along the walls staring at nothing, waiting for death. "I never agreed to sell this house, David. You don't have to agree to anything anymore." His voice carried that careful patience people use when they're explaining something to a child or someone they think isn't quite right in the head. The voice he'd probably learned in sales training for dealing with difficult customers. "I have power of attorney now. Dad signed the papers a month before he died. Everything's legal and proper." The lie came so smoothly, I almost believed it. But George would have told me about something that important. We'd spent hours discussing end-of-life decisions, our wills, funeral arrangements. We'd argued about whether to be buried or cremated, whether to donate our bodies to science, whether we wanted feeding tubes if we couldn't eat on our own. Power of attorney would have come up. It had to. The locksmith shifted uncomfortably, his drill hanging loose in his weathered hand. "Should I maybe come back later? Seems like there's some family discussion needed here." "No," David said firmly, his voice sharp with authority. "Install the lock. My mother sometimes forgets to secure the house properly. Last week she left it unlocked all night with the front door wide open. Anyone could have walked in." Another lie, and this one made my stomach turn. I'd been locking doors obsessively since George died, checking them twice, sometimes 3 times before bed, because the silence in the house made every small sound seem like an intruder. The house creaked differently without George in it, settled into loneliness in ways I'd never noticed before. But the locksmith was nodding like this made perfect sense. Poor old lady, can't remember basic safety, probably shouldn't be living alone. Better let the son handle things. I watched this stranger drill into the door George had painted blue 3 summers ago, Coastal Breeze the color was called. We'd spent a whole Saturday at Home Depot, me holding paint chips up to the late afternoon light while George pretended to be interested in trim brushes. He'd been patient with my indecision, had even suggested we buy sample cans to paint test patches on the garage wall. The door where he'd hung the wreath I made from rosemary in our garden every Christmas for 20 years. The door he'd carried me over the threshold 47 years ago, both of us laughing because he'd nearly dropped me trying to fish the keys out of his pocket while I was still in my wedding dress. "David," I said quietly, "you need to stop this right now. What I need, Mom, is for you to start being practical about your situation." He checked something off his clipboard with the air of a man who'd thought this through carefully, who'd made lists and contingency plans. "Your mind isn't what it used to be. You're forgetting things, making mistakes. Dad's been gone 3 days and you're already talking to him like he's still here." I felt heat rise in my cheeks, shame burning like a brand. Yesterday morning, I'd caught myself setting out 2 coffee cups instead of 1, the blue ceramic ones we'd bought on our anniversary trip to Vermont. Last night, I'd called out, "George, did you remember to turn off the porch light?" before remembering that George would never answer me again, would never check the locks or turn off the lights or kiss me goodnight. But grief wasn't dementia. Missing my husband wasn't incompetence. My mind is perfectly fine. Is it? Because yesterday Mrs. Patterson called me. She was concerned. David's voice took on that tone of manufactured sympathy that made my skin crawl. "She said you were in your front yard at midnight in your nightgown looking for Dad's car. She said you seemed confused about where he was, that you kept asking her if she'd seen him come home." Another lie. But this one was craftier, more believable. Mrs. Patterson was 85 with cataracts and hearing aids she forgot to wear half the time. She probably had seen someone in a nightgown wandering around, but it wouldn't have been me. I'd been inside all night, sitting in George's leather recliner, wearing his old flannel shirt because it still smelled like his aftershave and the peppermints he always kept in his pocket. But how could I prove that? Who would believe me over a concerned son and a well-meaning elderly neighbor? The locksmith finished installing the new deadbolt and handed David 2 shiny new keys. Not me, David. Like it was already his house. Like I was just a temporary occupant who'd overstayed her welcome. "Ma'am," the locksmith said to me as he packed up his tools, his voice gentle but firm, "your son's just looking out for you." My own mother went through the same thing after my dad passed. Sometimes we need help seeing what's best for ourselves when we're grieving. Sometimes the people who love us have to make the hard decisions. After they both left, I stood in my own doorway with my groceries growing warm in the evening air and realized I was locked out of my own home, the old key in my hand, the one George had given me when we first moved in as newlyweds, suddenly felt like a relic from someone else's life, like something from a museum, labeled with a placard, "This is how people used to live when they still had control over their own destinies." Before we continue, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to Never Too Old channel. We're creating a community of incredible people who know that our best chapters can happen at any age. Now, back to the story. Inside my own house, though it felt less like mine with each passing hour, I found evidence of David's campaign everywhere. The funeral flowers had only just begun to fade on the kitchen table and mantelpiece. Some still held their shape and color, though the edges of the roses had turned brown and papery, and the lilies had developed that heavy, sweet smell of decay that made me think of the funeral home. The condolence cards were still arriving daily, stuffed into the mailbox with their careful, scripted sympathy. But David had been busy while I grieved. I found him in George's study that first week after the locksmith left, going through the desk drawers like a detective searching for evidence of a crime. He'd pulled out every file folder, every receipt, every scrap of paper George had deemed worth keeping in his methodical way. Tax returns dating back to 1995 were spread across the leather desktop. Insurance policies lay open like dissected birds. Bank statements formed neat piles that David had organized by year and account type. The room smelled like George's cologne and the cherry pipe tobacco he'd smoked on winter evenings, reading mystery novels in his leather chair by the window. But now it felt violated, like someone had ransacked a shrine. "What are you looking for, David?" He didn't look up from the mountain of papers. Dad's files, financial records, insurance policies, asset documentation. "We need to know exactly what we're dealing with here before Sharon does her assessment tomorrow." He held up a folder thick with papers, waving it like evidence in a trial. "Did you know you owe $3,000 in property taxes? They're due next month. I had known. George and I had always paid property taxes in December, right after Christmas when the holiday expenses were behind us. It was our tradition, take care of the serious business after the joy was over, start the new year with a clean slate. We'd sit at this very desk together, writing checks and organizing receipts, planning for the year ahead. And look at this. He waved another paper at me like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. The roof needs replacing. The insurance adjuster's report from 2 years ago says it has maybe 5 years left, and that was 2 years ago. The heating system is from 1987. It's held together with duct tape and prayers. The electrical hasn't been updated since the Clinton administration. Each criticism felt like a small knife. George had maintained this house with his own hands for decades. He'd patched the roof himself until his arthritis made climbing ladders dangerous. He'd nursed that old furnace through 20 winters, cleaning the filters religiously, replacing parts he ordered from catalogs because the model was so old. The electrical worked fine, we'd never had a single problem with it. This place is a money pit, Mom. A liability. You're sitting on $250,000 in equity that's just bleeding away with every repair bill. Every month you stay here paying for upkeep on systems that should have been replaced years ago. I looked around George's study. Our study, really. The built-in bookshelves he'd constructed himself, level and square, and painted the soft blue I'd chosen. The window seat where I'd read novels on summer afternoons while he worked at his desk. The Persian rug we'd bought at an estate sale in Portland. The one the cat had thrown up on twice, but that still cleaned up beautiful. Your father loved this house. Dad's dead, Mom. The words came out flat, matter of fact, like he was discussing the weather. And sentiment doesn't pay for a new roof or a furnace that actually heats the whole house instead of just the living room. I watched my son rifle through my husband's papers like they were his own inheritance, already sold and distributed. The same boy who used to build forts under this very desk while George worked, using the rolling chair as a race car and the bottom drawer as a secret hideout, who George had taught to use a level and a measuring tape, how to read blueprints and calculate square footage, who had promised his father with tears streaming down his face at the funeral that he'd take care of Mom, that Dad didn't need to worry about leaving me alone. This wasn't taking care of me. This was taking care of a problem. I think you should go home to Linda and the kids now, I said quietly. He didn't look up from the papers scattered across the desk like autumn leaves. I am looking out for your best interests, whether you can see it or not. My best interests include privacy and respect. Privacy doesn't pay for memory care when you inevitably need it. Respect doesn't cover the cost of round-the-clock nursing when you fall and break a hip. The words were like ice water in my veins. Memory care, round-the-clock nursing. He was already planning for my incompetence, my decline, my eventual helplessness, already calculating the cost of warehousing me until I died. David, I want you to leave now. I'm trying to help you plan for reality, Mom. You're 73 years old. You've been dependent on Dad for everything. He paid the bills, handled the insurance, dealt with repairs and maintenance. You don't even know how to use the computer he bought you. That stung because it was partly true. George had handled most of the financial details because he enjoyed the organization of it, the neat columns and balanced accounts. But I wasn't helpless. I'd managed our household budget for 47 years. Had raised 2 children mostly on my own while George worked 60-hour weeks building his accounting practice. I know more than you think I do. Do you? Do you know what the mortgage balance is? Do you know when the homeowner's insurance expires? Do you know who to call when the furnace stops working or the pipes freeze? I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't know some of those details. George had always handled them, had always been there to handle them. The knowledge was in his head, in his files, in systems I'd never needed to learn because I'd always had him. But not knowing something wasn't the same as being incapable of learning it. I can figure it out. You shouldn't have to. There's the right to let someone else worry about the details. His voice took on that sales training smoothness again, the tone he probably used to convince clients to buy more coverage than they needed. Sunset Manor handles everything. Maintenance, meals, medication management, social activities. You'll have friends your own age, people to talk to. You won't be rattling around in this big empty house, surrounded by memories that just make you sad. I looked around the study again at the photos on George's desk, our wedding picture, the kids at various ages, grandchildren I barely saw because they lived 3 states away with David's ex-wife, at the coffee mug that still sat on his desk blotter, the one that said "World's Greatest Dad" that the kids had given him for Father's Day 15 years ago, at the reading glasses he'd left folded on top of a crossword puzzle he'd never finished. These weren't just memories that made me sad. They were the only things I had left of a life we'd built together. They were proof that George and I had existed, had mattered, had created something worth preserving. This house is full of our life together. This house is full of stuff, Mom. Objects, things. They're not actually Dad, you know that, right? Getting rid of his coffee mug isn't going to make him any more dead than he already is. The cruelty of it took my breath away. This was my son, the baby I'd nursed through colic and night terrors, the little boy who'd cried when his goldfish died and insisted we have a funeral for it in the backyard. The teenager who'd called me from college, homesick and scared, needing to hear my voice to feel connected to something solid. When had he become this cold, calculating stranger who could dismiss his father's memory as stuff? After he left, promising to return early the next morning to help me get ready for Sharon's visit, I sat in George's chair and opened the bottom drawer he'd been so interested in. Behind the old tax returns and expired warranties, beneath a manila folder full of appliance manuals for toasters and coffee makers we'd replaced years ago, my fingers found the edge of something David had missed. A manila envelope, thick as a small book, with my name written in George's careful handwriting across the front. Not Ruth Morrison like on our official documents, but my dearest Ruth in the flowing script he'd used to write me love letters when we were first married. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a deed to a cabin at Lake Tahoe, paid in full, never mentioned to the children. And a letter dated just 6 months ago, written in the blue ink from the fountain pen I'd given him for our 30th anniversary. My dearest Ruth, if you're reading this, I'm gone and David's probably already making plans. I've seen the way he looks at this house when he visits, not like a home where he grew up, but like an asset to be liquidated. Not like the place where his mother lives, but like a problem to be solved. The cabin is yours and yours alone. I bought it with money from my father's estate, money that was never part of our joint accounts, never listed on any documents David might find. It's the place where we spent our 20th anniversary, where you said you felt like yourself for the first time in years. I never forgot that. When things get difficult, and they will, because I know our son, use it. Take your time. Take your power back. Remember who you were before you became someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's problem to manage. I love you more than I ever said out loud, more than I had words for in 47 years of marriage. You are stronger than you remember. Don't let them convince you otherwise. Always yours, George. I read the letter 3 times, my tears making the ink blur slightly. Then I pressed it against my chest and cried. Not the desperate, gasping sobs of grief I'd been living with since the funeral, but the slow, steady tears of someone who'd just been reminded that she was loved, that she mattered, that someone had believed in her strength even when she'd forgotten it herself. George had been planning my escape route for months, maybe years. He'd seen what I was too loyal to see, that David had stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as his burden. And he'd given me the one thing David couldn't take away: choices. I locked the letter and deed in the small safe George had installed behind his framed Navy discharge certificate. The safe David didn't know existed because George had built the frame himself, with a hidden hinge that looked like simple wall hanging. Tomorrow I would let Sharon, the realtor, walk through my house and make her assessments. I would listen to David explain why selling was the only practical option. I would nod and seem to consider their arguments. But I wouldn't tell them about Lake Tahoe. That was mine. The realtor arrived the next morning at exactly 9 o'clock, punctual as death and twice as cheerful. Sharon Williams drove a white BMW with vanity plates that read "Sold It," and wore the kind of aggressive smile that made you want to check your pockets to make sure your wallet was still there. David was already waiting in my driveway, pacing like an expectant father outside a delivery room. He'd been there since 8:30, I'd seen him through the kitchen window as I made my coffee. One cup now, though my hand still reached automatically for the second one, George would never need again. Mrs. Morrison. Sharon's voice could have cut glass. She clicked across my walkway in heels that belonged in a boardroom, not on a 73-year-old widow's front porch. I'm so excited to see this property. David's told me so much about it. I'll bet he had. She introduced herself like we were old friends, pumping my hand with the enthusiasm of someone who'd already calculated her commission. David had briefed her well. She knew exactly how to position this, how to make it sound like she was doing me a favor instead of facilitating my eviction. What a charming property, Sharon said, already making notes on her phone before she'd even stepped inside. David mentioned you're looking to downsize, simplify your life. Smart thinking. Houses this size are just too much work for someone in their golden years. Golden years. As if being widowed and displaced was some kind of precious metal. They moved through my home like a pair of appraisers inventorying the contents of an estate sale. Sharon photographed everything, the kitchen where George had made me coffee every morning for 47 years, measuring the counter space and muttering about dated finishes and limited storage. She opened cabinets without asking, peered into closets, ran her manicured fingers along windowsills checking for dust. In the living room, she examined the hardwood floors. George and I had refinished ourselves the second year we lived here, when money was tight and we couldn't afford to hire professionals. We'd rented sanders and spent 3 weekends on our hands and knees, breathing sawdust and arguing about wood stain colors. The floors still gleamed, still bore the slight imperfections that proved they'd been touched by human hands rather than machines. Original hardwood is always a selling point, Sharon told David, as if I wasn't standing right there. Though they'll probably want to update the living room configuration, this whole wall could come out, open up the space. Very popular with buyers these days, that great room concept. The wall she wanted to remove was where George had built floor-to-ceiling bookshelves for my collection of mystery novels, where we'd hung our wedding portrait and photos of the children growing up, where the small secretary desk sat that had belonged to my grandmother, where I'd written letters and paid bills and kept the family calendar for decades. The master bathroom will need a complete overhaul, Sharon continued, clicking through the house with David trailing behind her like an eager puppy. The tile is very dated. And who uses a bathtub anymore? Everyone wants walk-in showers now. Much more practical for the demographic that can afford this price point. George had installed that tile himself when I was pregnant with David. Blue and white, a pattern I'd found in a magazine and fallen in love with. The bathtub where I'd soaked away the aches of pregnancy, where we'd bathed 2 babies who squirmed and splashed and made the bathroom floor a swamp of towels and laughter. Mom, why don't you show Sharon the basement? David suggested, his voice carrying that false cheerfulness people use when they're trying to manage a difficult situation. She needs to see everything. The basement was George's workshop, his retreat when the noise of family life upstairs became too much. His workbench still held the projects he'd never finished, a jewelry box he'd been making for our granddaughter's birthday, a broken clock he'd been trying to repair for Mrs. Peterson next door. The walls were lined with tools organized with military precision, each one hanging in its designated spot, outlined in black marker so he'd know exactly where everything belonged. Great bones down here, Sharon said, as if she were complimenting the skeletal structure of a corpse. This could be finished as a family room. Add some carpet, a wet bar, really maximize the square footage. I thought about George down here on winter evenings, the smell of sawdust and WD-40, the sound of classical music playing on his old radio while he worked with his hands, the quiet concentration on his face as he measured twice and cut once, the way he'd taught David to work with wood before David decided he was too good for manual labor. The lot size is impressive, Sharon continued, moving back upstairs to peer out at our backyard through the kitchen window. 1/4 acre, mature landscaping. The vegetable garden will have to go, of course. Most buyers want low-maintenance yards these days. The vegetable garden. George's pride and joy. The place where he'd grown tomatoes and peppers and the sweet corn we'd eaten every August, so fresh the kernels would pop when you bit them. Where he'd taught me to tell when the cucumbers were ready, when the squash needed picking, how to train the bean vines up their poles. Every spring for 45 years we'd planned that garden together. sitting at the kitchen table with seed catalogs spread between us, arguing about whether to try something new or stick with the varieties we knew would grow well in our soil. George would draw diagrams on graph paper, calculating spacing and planting schedules, while I made lists of what we'd can and freeze and give away to neighbors. Of course, buyers in this price range typically aren't interested in maintaining extensive gardens, Sharon explained to David, as if gardening was some kind of character flaw. They want move-in ready turnkey properties, something they can enjoy without the work. Mom, you have to admit the gardens become too much for you anyway, David said. Dad always did the heavy work. You can't manage it alone. Another assumption. Another decision made about my capabilities without consulting me. I'd been working in that garden since before David was born. I knew every plant, every season, every quirk of drainage and sun exposure. I knew which tomatoes would ripen first and which peppers needed extra water. I knew where the soil was richest and where we needed to add compost each spring. But Sharon and David had already moved on, discussing square footage and comparable sales, market conditions and optimal listing strategies. They talked about my home like it was a commodity, a collection of assets to be optimized for maximum return. We're thinking a listing price of $275,000, Sharon told David, again as if I was deaf or absent. The market's strong right now for properties in this condition. With the right staging, we could probably get close to asking. 275. I tried to attach that number to the place where I'd lived for nearly 50 years, where I'd brought babies home from the hospital, where I'd nursed them through chickenpox and broken hearts and teenage rebellion, where George and I had fought and made up and grown old together, where he died in our bed upstairs holding my hand and telling me he loved me with his last conscious breath. How do you put a price on a lifetime? And you've already identified the perfect care facility, Sharon continued. Sunset Manor has an excellent reputation. Very well run, beautiful grounds, much more suitable for someone of your mother's age. Someone of my age. As if being 73 automatically disqualified me from having preferences, opinions, or the right to choose where I spent my remaining years. The timing is perfect, David added, consulting his clipboard again. The sooner we can close, the sooner Mom can get settled in her new place. Start fresh, make new friends. It'll be good for you, Mom. You'll see. I would see. Like I was a child being promised that medicine would taste good if I just tried it. After they finished their assessment, David and Sharon stood in my front yard discussing next steps, marketing strategies and professional photography, staging consultations and showing schedules. They spoke in code, the language of an industry that turned homes into investments and people into problems to be solved. I watched them from my kitchen window, Sharon gesturing expansively at my house like she was conducting an orchestra, David nodding and taking notes. Two people planning the liquidation of my life while I stood invisible behind glass. But I had something they didn't know about, something George had given me that David couldn't access, couldn't sell, couldn't turn into a solution for his own problems. I had Lake Tahoe. That afternoon, while David was at Sharon's office signing listing agreements and scheduling contractors for staging improvements, I drove to the library. I told the librarian I needed to use a computer to look up some information, and she set me up at a terminal with patient instructions about clicking and typing that I didn't really need but accepted gracefully. I searched for flights to Reno, for rental car agencies, for the small town near Lake Tahoe that George had written about in his letter. And I found something else in his envelope that I'd missed the first time, a business card for a lawyer in Tahoe City, with a handwritten note on the back. She knows about the cabin. Call when you're ready. I was ready. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. David arrived the next morning with coffee and croissants from the bakery downtown, the kind of peace offering that meant he was about to ask for something I wouldn't want to give. I brought breakfast, he said, settling the white bakery bag on my kitchen table like he was laying down weapons before a negotiation. Thought we could talk about the timeline for everything. Timeline. Like my displacement was a project to be managed, with deadlines and deliverables. Sharon wants to list the house next week. The photographer's coming Thursday to take pictures, and she's arranged for a staging consultant to come tomorrow and advise us on what furniture needs to go into storage. What furniture needs to go into storage? I repeated. Well, obviously, most of it. The house shows better with minimal furniture, more space for buyers to envision their own things. And frankly, Mom, most of this stuff wouldn't fit in your new place anyway. He gestured around my kitchen like he was pointing out evidence of hoarding rather than the accumulation of a lifetime. The oak table where we'd eaten thousands of meals, the china cabinet that held my grandmother's dishes, the rocking chair where I'd nursed both my children. Sunset Manor provides all the furniture you'll need. Very nice stuff, too. Much newer than what you have here. Newer. As if the age of my furniture was a flaw rather than a feature. As if the wear patterns and small repairs didn't represent decades of use and love and life lived within these rooms. I haven't agreed to any of this, David. Mom, we've been through this. I'm trying to make this as easy as possible for you, but it's happening either way. You can cooperate and make it smooth, or you can fight it and make it miserable for everyone. The mask was slipping. The concerned son was becoming the frustrated businessman who'd encountered an obstacle to his plans. I've been thinking, I said carefully. Maybe I should get a second opinion. Talk to someone else about my options. What kind of second opinion? A lawyer. Someone who can explain exactly what my rights are in this situation. David's jaw tightened. That's not necessary. I've already consulted with attorneys. Everything we're doing is completely legal and in your best interests. Then you won't mind if I verify that with my own legal counsel. Fine. Waste money on lawyers if it makes you feel better. But it won't change anything. The house is going on the market next week, and you're moving to Sunset Manor by the end of the month. Those are the facts. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table and dialed the number on the business card George had left me. A woman answered on the second ring, Carolyn Mitchell's office. Miss Mitchell, this is Ruth Morrison. My husband left me your card. He said you knew about a cabin at Lake Tahoe. There was a pause, then warmth flooded her voice. Mrs. Morrison, I've been expecting your call. George was very specific about when you might need my help. Can you come to Tahoe City? There are some things we need to discuss in person. 2 days later, I told David I was going to visit my cousin in Sacramento. A lie, but a useful one. I packed a small suitcase and drove to the airport, my hands shaking as I bought a ticket to Reno. The flight was only 2 hours, but it felt like traveling to another world. When I landed, I rented a car and drove through the mountains to Lake Tahoe, following directions George had written in his careful handwriting. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it from our 20th anniversary trip. Small and perfect, nestled among pine trees with a view of the lake that made your heart stop. George had managed to buy the place we'd fallen in love with, had kept it secret for years while he planned for the day I might need an escape. Carolyn Mitchell was waiting for me on the cabin's front porch, a woman about my age with kind eyes and silver hair. She handed me a key and a folder of documents. George set this up very carefully, she explained. The cabin is in a trust with you as the sole beneficiary. It's completely separate from any assets your son might try to access. There's also a bank account to cover taxes and maintenance, enough to last you many years if you're careful. I sat in the rocking chair where George and I had watched sunsets 27 years ago and cried. Not from grief this time, but from gratitude. My husband had seen what I'd been too loyal to see, that our son had stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as his burden. There's more, Carolyn said gently. George left very specific instructions about what to do if David tried to force you from your home. He documented everything, his concerns about David's motivations, his observations about David's financial situation, even recordings of conversations where David discussed your supposed mental decline. Recordings? George was more suspicious than you knew. He started documenting things months ago when David began pressuring him about your future care. David thought he was manipulating a grieving old man. He had no idea George was building a case. I stayed at the cabin for a week, walking in the mountains and sitting by the lake, remembering who I was before I became someone's problem to solve. When I returned home, David was waiting with papers to sign and boxes to pack. "Where were you?" he demanded. "Your cousin in Sacramento said she never heard from you." "I went somewhere I needed to go. You can't just disappear like that. What if something had happened to you? Something did happen to me. I remembered that I'm not actually helpless. David's face flushed. Don't be dramatic. I'm trying to help you. No, you're trying to help yourself. To my house, to my money, to whatever equity you can squeeze out of liquidating my life. That's not. I know about the gambling debts, David. The second mortgage on your house. The credit cards you've maxed out trying to maintain a lifestyle you can't afford. His face went white. How do you? Your father knew. He knew everything, including how you've been lying to me about power of attorney, about my supposed mental incompetence, about having my best interests at heart. I pulled out my phone and played one of George's recordings. David's voice, clear as day, discussing how to manage Mom's resistance to the inevitable and minimize her legal options. Dad was recording me. Dad was protecting me from you. The guardianship hearing was swift and decisive. David's lawyer tried to present me as a confused widow making poor decisions, but Carolyn had prepared well. George's documentation painted a clear picture of David's manipulation and financial motivations. When the judge asked David to produce the power of attorney documents he'd claimed to have, David's lawyer requested a recess. They never came back from their conference. Mrs. Morrison, the judge said, you are clearly competent to make your own decisions. Mr. Morrison, you are prohibited from making any further legal claims regarding your mother's capacity without clear medical evidence from multiple independent physicians. That evening, I sat on my own porch in my own house and called David. He answered on the first ring. Mom? David, I'm not cutting you out of my life. You're my son and I love you, but I won't let you lie to me again, and I won't let you make decisions for me that I'm perfectly capable of making myself. I thought I was helping. You thought you were solving a problem. The problem was never me, David. It was your debt, your poor choices, your assumption that my life was yours to manage.
What happens now?
Now you figure out your own financial problems without using me as collateral. And maybe when you've learned to see me as your mother instead of your inheritance, we can rebuild what you almost destroyed. I hung up and poured myself a glass of wine. Tomorrow I would start planning improvements to the house, not to sell it, but to make it more comfortable for the years I intended to spend here. I would plant George's garden and tend his roses. I would live in the home we'd built together, on my own terms for as long as I chose. And if I ever needed to escape again, I had a cabin by a lake where the sunsets lasted forever, and the only voice in my head would be my own. George had given me more than a retreat. He'd given me the power to choose my own ending, and I chose to stay. So, that's my story. I'd love to hear what you think if you were in my shoes. Would you have told David about the cabin, or kept it a secret like I did? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like mine.